Bear with me, I promise this part will make sense before the speech is over. Imagine, if you will, the following images. Benedict Cumberbatch holding a screwdriver. Your second grade PE coach holding a large red 16. Simon Cowell from American Idol shuffling a deck of playing cards. A skeleton laying in the corner, clutching a book with a face of a cartoon character of your choice on the cover. A man in a toga yelling at a piece of moss. A laptop open to BuzzFeed with a human brain sitting on the keyboard. And finally, me, wearing a very old-fashioned cap. In the very popular and critically acclaimed BBC adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, simply entitled Sherlock, the main character performs daring rescues, feats of amazing mental agility, and of course the requisite deduction, all by calling upon the massive amounts of information that he has memorized. Sherlock Holmes is able to surpass the typical limits of human memory through a technique known as the Mind Palace. However, unlike other things Stephen Moffat writes about, the Mind Palace is neither hopeful science fiction nor psychobabble, but instead is a very real technique dating back to the beginnings of rhetoric itself and still in use today by some of the best memory experts on the planet. However, the Mind Palace is not restricted to just the talented or experts of memory, but instead can be used by everyone in the room, starting right now. To see how, we need to first see what the Mind Palace is, then how it works, before finally delving through an example of its use so that we can all learn how to use the Mind Palace. If you're going to try to use something, you typically need to have some idea of what that thing is. So let's see what the Mind Palace is. First, in its definition, and then its origin. First, the Mind Palace is a mnemonic device in which a memorizer arranges the things that they need to remember spatially rather than learning it through repetition. The Journal for Advances in Physiology Education reports on June 14, 2014, that students using the Mind Palace see a 16% increase in their ability to memorize topics in endocrinology over students using repetition-based techniques. Admittedly, 16% may not seem like the greatest leap at first, but it's important to remember that not only did these students have no prior training with the Mind Palace, but that both groups of students were tested immediately after their respective study sessions, where repetition-based memory has its greatest advantage. Furthermore, MemorySports.com, updated daily, says that the top-level competitors in memory competitions advocate for this particular technique. One such advocate is Simon Reinhardt, who in December 2013 set a world record using the technique by, in just a few minutes, memorizing the order of 370 different playing cards at a memory competition in Saudi Arabia. Second, the Mind Palace is not a new device, but instead finds its origin in that school of thought near and dear to all our hearts, rhetoric. Cicero, that first century BC genius of speech, attributed the Mind Palace's creation to ancient Greek poet Simonides. Supposedly, Simonides was attending a dinner party, and when he stepped outside, the roof of the party collapsed, killing everyone inside and mangling the bodies beyond recognition. Fortunately, Simonides was able to call upon his visual memory of how the guests had been arranged, and thus was able to identify the bodies. He later concluded that this technique was drastically superior to the ways he'd been memorizing his poems prior, and thus, the Mind Palace was born. Regardless of this story's veracity, or lack thereof, Nigel Thomas writes for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that we know for a fact that the Mind Palace was in use during the time of Cicero and Quintilius in the ancient Roman Empire, and continued in popular use until after the Renaissance. To see how the Mind Palace became and remained so very popular, it is important that we understand what it does, first in its function, and then what it achieves in the brain of the user. First, Cicero writes of the Mind Palace in his De Orator that persons wishing to exercise this faculty should first visualize a space, and then assign to the things which need to be remembered images, and then store the images in the place so that the order of the places preserves the order of the images, and the images denote the things themselves. In less ancient Roman terms, Richard Most, Vice Chair for Psychiatry at Mount Sinai Medical School, writes for How Stuff Works that the mind palace is a technique in which the memorizer takes the things that they need to remember and divides them into discrete chunks. They then assign to each of the chunks a very specific and highly memorable image. They then call upon the memory of a sufficiently elaborate but very familiar space, such as their childhood home, high school, or forensics team office. They then place each of those images in that place along a very specific and easily remembered route. Then when they're giving a speech or taking a test, they simply walk along that route in their mind, seeing each of the images they've stored there, and thus remembering what they need to remember. Admittedly, this would sound like a lot of clickbait were it not so thoroughly documented in the historical record. Furthermore, though, we've recently gained an understanding of neurology sufficient to explain why the mind palace would be superior to other mnemonic devices. Neurorexia.com, a website devoted to a casual understanding of neurology, reports on June 14, 2014, that the mind palace engages the most active and developed parts of the conscious brain, the parts responsible for spatial navigation and visual comprehension. By channeling memorization through these more developed parts of the brain, a user of the mind palace is able to memorize far more rapidly and wholly than would be possible using the less developed parts of the brain responsible for language and numbers. This all sounds well and good, but it doesn't do any of us any good if we don't understand how to use it. So let's go through an example. Do you remember the images I told you at the beginning of the speech? I'd say you remember at least one or two, right? I happen to remember all of them because they constitute my mind palace for this speech, which happens to be my forensics team's office and the stairs directly beneath it. So let's go through my mind palace so we can see how this really works. I begin one floor beneath the office, where I see Sherlock Holmes, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, and all the information related to my Sherlock Holmes introduction comes immediately to mind. He's holding a sonic screwdriver, reminding me of the Doctor Who Stephen Moffat joke about halfway through. Further up the stairs, I see Coach Jewell, my very aggressive PE coach from second grade. Fortunately, he's not yelling at me or telling me to run faster. He's just holding a large red 16. So I remember that the Physiology Education Journal indicated a 16% increase in memory capacity when using the mind palace. To my right is Simon Cowell from American Idol, just shuffling a deck of playing cards, and all the information related to Simon Reinhardt's record of memorizing 370 playing cards comes immediately to mind. Further up the stairs and across from the office door is a skeleton. It doesn't have any features to speak of, so it can only be identified by some oddities. The book it's clutching has the face of Nigel Thornberry on it, a beloved cartoon character from my childhood. And thus I remember what Nigel Thomas writes in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. As I enter the office, I'm greeted with the image of a Roman in a toga giving a speech to a piece of moss. I know to give you Cicero's explanation of the mind palace, and then the explanation of Richard Most. I turn to my coach's desk, upon which sits a laptop, open to BuzzFeed, the clickbait transition, with a human brain sitting on the keyboard, which seems far less ominous when I remember it's there to remind me to give you Neurex's explanation of the mind palace. Behind the desk is me. I remember upon seeing myself to give you my own experience using the mind palace in my third point. The old-fashioned cap I'm wearing? Well, it's Sherlock Holmes's, and leads me into my conclusion. The mind palace does not promise to turn us all into genius consulting detectives. What it does do is offer a natural, intuitive way to memorize large sets of information using the skills we already do best anyways, navigating a physical, visual world. It promises to turn even arduous memorization tasks, well, elementary.